Hey everyone, this is Andre. On September 29th, Marvel's much ridiculed and heavily criticized Inhumans premiered on ABC, 1 month after the pilot honestly failed to impress anyone in IMAX. Today, we will first provide a recap of the events that led to the Inhumans coming to TV and how it has influenced other properties. Then we'll talk about what expectations we had going in. Then we'll share our opinions on the pilot episode, the one on which the entire show is judged, because it was, released on IMAX. After that, we'll cover the TV ratings for said pilot and discuss just how the hell this could have happened. Then we'll briefly give our impressions of the third episode, and finally, let you know how excited we are for the rest of the series.
Well, the Inhumans really didn't have much of a history on television or on film up until fairly recently. They had a long history in Marvel Comics dating all the way back to the early 60s with the original Fantastic Four. Since then, they've appeared on a few cartoons. They were introduced on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But as far as their history on film, it really started in October of 2014 when at a press event, Kevin Feige announced the beginnings of Marvel Phase 3 at the El Capitan Theater in Los Angeles. He announced several films: Thor Ragnarok, Captain America Civil War, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, and on the slate was The Inhumans, which honestly took a lot of people by surprise just because of the obscure nature of the property. But then things started to go a little wonky, as they say. In February of 2015, the rumor that Marvel and Sony were going to share custody of Spider-Man and that Spider-Man would in fact be a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, this had been leaked in the famous Sony hack a few months prior, but it was official now. And as a result, a lot of movies got pushed back because Sony and Marvel were putting a Spider-Man movie on the slate for July of 2017, which became Spider-Man Homecoming. Thor Ragnarok got pushed back, Black Panther was getting pushed back, and the Inhumans got pushed back subsequently to 2019. And then in August of 2015, there was the shakeup at Marvel. Kevin Feige was able to wrest control of Marvel Studios away from Ike Perlmutter, and the only person he had to answer to now was Alan Horn. Now, this is significant in a couple different ways. It was really Ike Perlmutter that we believe wanted the Inhumans movie as sort of a de facto X-Men, since Fox still had control of them. And it kind of gave Kevin Feige free reign to do whatever he wanted. Up until then, he was on a pretty tight leash, and he had to go through Ike Perlmutter. Now that wasn't the case. And so, in April of 2016, the Inhumans were pulled from the release schedule. Now, a lot of people thought that was the end of the Inhumans. That was it. There's going to be no Inhumans movie. But in November of that year, Marvel announced that the Inhumans were coming to television, and that the series was going to be filmed in IMAX, and that the first 2 episodes were actually going to appear in IMAX theaters, with the subsequent 6 episodes remaining appearing on ABC television. And up until then, they were relegated to minor characters and background players in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And that was allegedly to set up an Inhumans movie, but now that we had the Inhumans actually have their own TV series, that has kind of been thrown out the window, more or less. So that's a brief rundown of the Inhumans' history on television and in film.
So Rob, you are a huge fan of the Inhumans, and for anyone in doubt and want to learn more about the Inhumans, go over to Rob's channel, Robot Shlomo, where you have a great video detailing the history and background of the Inhumans.
Yes, I was one of the few people actually to do any kind of informational gathering on the Inhumans, and you can check out that video. It's actually very detailed, and we explain the history of the characters and some of their powers and give you the nuts and bolts of what the Inhumans are all about.
But still, they're fairly obscure, aren't they? It's not like there's been a massive demand for an Inhumans movie, so they're relatively unknown to the audience at large. How big are they from the comic?
They're not really that big. They have a cult following. I've often said they're kind of like that band that you love, but you try to get other people into. And the more you learn about them, the more you like them, the more you want to tell people about them. But kind of like the Eternals, or kind of like Nova is more well known, but they're kind of on that same footing. They've always been sort of background players in the Marvel Universe.
Well, one possible fan of the Inhumans might be Clive Barker. because if you compare the Inhumans with Clive Barker's Nightbreed, I see a lot of similarities between the two properties. Midian is where the monsters dwell, just as Attilan is where the Inhumans dwell.
Clive Barker, mostly well known for the Hellraiser films and his books, was heavily influenced by comics, including the Inhumans, and also worked with Marvel quite a bit, including a Hellraiser, a Nightbreed comic, and a few other original comic titles, if I remember correctly. So it goes to show that even though they're not very well known, they're very influential throughout media, especially when it comes to the interesting, intricate story that was built for this set of characters that originally started off more so as an X-Men ripoff and had to establish themselves in their own way, and that's kind of where they're trying to differentiate themselves, is their unique story. And like you said, Nightbreed borrows a lot from the Inhumans, it seems, so it's very easy to see their influence, at least more so than even if they're not as well known.
Yeah, so this might be another case of one property ripping off another, and then the rip-off gets more mainstream knowledge than what inspired it in the first place. Now finally, the Inhumans have their own TV series, and of course that release has been somewhat marred by really bad reviews, and before the reviews were bad, the trailers were bad, and before the trailers were bad, the stills were bad. So having seen all of this, how excited were you going into the Inhumans?
Well, Andre, I think you remember that I very calmly and very reasonably stated my feelings about the upcoming Inhuman series on one of the previous podcasts. I think I made my case quite well in a very well-reasoned manner.
Where did it go? Where did it go? Where did it go? You spent $80 million on this thing! Where did the fucking money go? Jesus Christ, this is a fan trailer! Where did the money go on this? How could it be this bad?
There it is.
I don't understand. It doesn't look cheap. It looks blatantly cheap. This looks like something I would have seen out of the 1990s, the early 1990s, like that stupid Captain America movie they made where he was strapped to the rocket.
With Ned Beatty?
Yeah, exactly. Ned Beatty might have been actually pretty good in this. Like I said, it looks cheap. Medusa looks like Morticia Adams. Maximus, the only thing that got right was Maximus the Mad, and the guy can't act for shit. Why are they using guns? They're Inhumans! They have no power! Like, what the fuck are you doing? Does anybody know anything about the Inhumans who worked on this thing? Apparently not.
Yes, and that was Robb expressing his opinion in his usual calm and reflected manner. Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, considering all that we've reported here, everything we've seen, and as you said, the way that the trailers and the photos looked, they looked atrocious, and they looked like the 90s X-Men series. And so I had very low expectations going in. I was aware of, like, Medusa and Black Bolt, but other than that, I had no real source of real perspective as far as the comic book origins, other than what I learned from Robb going in. I did actually research them a little bit more afterwards, but more on that later. TV, though, for the most part, has been hit and miss, mostly. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. really did fail to connect with a broad audience, including myself and you and Robb as well. I gave up on that after the season and a half, basically. Agent Carter was good, and it did well enough to get a second series out of it, but it didn't go any farther. And the Netflix series have mostly been good, but as we know, Iron Fist and the Defenders have gotten either negative to, mixed reviews at this point. So, needless to say, TV has been an arena where Marvel hasn't had a lot of luck, so my expectations were very low, like dirt low.
And as for me, when the move from feature film to TV first happened, I was actually excited. I thought, this is a great move. This is a perfect way of expanding the story for something as huge as the Inhumans, with a Kree connection and everything. And this isn't going to be like a cheap Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. style TV show. No. They're working with IMAX. This is going to be great. They're probably going to get Vin Diesel. That's what I was thinking when this was first announced. Boy, was I wrong. The moment that Scott Buck was announced as the showrunner, that's when I lost all hope for Inhumans. Just as I lost all hope for Iron Fist, a series that I still haven't been able to work up the enthusiasm to see, just because I know that Scott Buck is showrunner, and I know that series has been slaughtered in the reviews since its release. Well, I knew that was going to happen, because I saw seasons 6 and 7 of Dexter, which were the ones that he was showrunner on. And they were, apart from a few moments here and there, god-awful, especially the finale. And for those that do not know, the Dexter finale is considered the worst series finale of all time. And that's exclusively thanks to Scott Buck wanting to make an ending that he thought was poignant and important. And then, when I saw the pictures, it was even worse than I could ever have imagined. Because I still thought that, okay, fine, Scott Buck is the one doing the writing and the show running, but they're still going to have the Marvel machine behind them, making sure that it at least is going to look good. Well, all the skilled people must have gone on vacation or something, because that looked like shit in the pictures, and it looked even worse in the trailers. So my expectations going in were rock bottom, and if it had been more than a double episode, just like Iron Fist, I don't know if I would have been able to work up the enthusiasm to even go and see it in the first place. So yeah, a little bit biased there from my end, have to admit that. Expecting it to be dreadful. So now that we have cleared our expectations, which, as you can tell, weren't all that high, what did we think about the episode itself? Tom?
As I said a little bit before, I did do a little bit more research about the Inhumans after seeing the show, and basically I was even more disappointed because I seen how much potential they had here. The characters in the show had no development. At least Terrigenesis and the Inhumans themselves were set up a lot better in S.H.I.E.L.D. than they were here. The writing was piss poor. There was so many inconsistencies. No setup or development for the characters or their powers. Karnak, for instance. They do a really poor job at setting up his powers, but we have one scene where he, is shot in one scenario, so then he goes back, and I guess just to kind of set up, his whole power is supposed to be that he can find a weakness in anything. So, and how this works for him is in his mind is he can kind of rewind and play different scenarios in his mind. So we set this up earlier on where he basically prevents himself from being killed, and then later on he's on top of this mountain, falls down, and doesn't even go back and change the scenario or anything like that in a perfect situation where his powers would be handy. And it would be different if they set up that their powers didn't work on Earth.
I got the impression that someone needs to give him a choice before his powers kick
Really?
in.
Okay, see, they didn't set that up though. And as I said before, the plot had a lot of potential, but it was executed hideously. And, and speaking of the characters, it was easier to sympathize with the plight of the villain than our heroes, who in their own way seem like elitists and isolationists and racists and repressionists and, in this feudalist society, and they don't even really do a good job of setting that up. And if anything, that gets kind of the most set up with Maximus. The actors aren't given anything to work with. I mean, the effects were horrible. We've seen that already in the trailers, and they are the same here. And considering the amount of money that was spent, as Andre pointed out, especially with being shot with IMAX cameras in some scenes, everything just looked worse, especially the makeup and stuff like that. It's just an atrocious, ugly looking mess, and they should be ashamed of themselves for this entire fiasco. It was nothing more than an attempt to make something that replaced the X-Men, and it looks like something from the X-Men in the 90s. Could have been Marvel's Game of Thrones, really. And they fucked that up.
It's hard to argue with any of those points. I thought exactly the same things when I saw the trailers and when I saw the stills. This looks cheap. This looks low budget. It looks like it's straight out of the 90s. It looks like a 90s version of what a superhero movie or TV show would have been. And in 2017, we've just gotten so far beyond that there's no excuse for this. Some of the elements I did recognize from the Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee series, and this is going to be a few spoilers: the cutting of the Medusa's hair, and young man who goes into the Terrigenesis and he is relegated to work in the mines. Those guys are known as alpha primitives, the ones that the Terrigenesis is not kind towards, and there's a whole subplot about that, and I don't know if it's going to be coming later about this, about how Maximus is sort of responsible for that. But in the comics, they are actually quite a bit more deformed than what you see here. And just the effects were cheap. Lockjaw looked cheap. He didn't look very well integrated into the rest of the action. The story and the dialogue was just flat. The scenery in Hawaii was nice, but that's more ode to Hawaii. You could shoot probably a junkyard in Hawaii and it would look nice. It's just so baffling of how this could have happened. And the CGI and the way they made Adeland look, some parts of it were okay, but some of it looked like it was made with Lego blocks. It was just uneven. This is confusing as to say, how can someone look at this and pat themselves on the back? Hey, good job, guys. To me, that's the biggest shocker of all. How could this be deemed acceptable?
Well, you bring up a good point. The Netflix series as a good example in comparison. They do so much with so little and stretch every dime. Here, we're really hard pressed to see every dime on screen. We're like, where did the fucking money go? Because we're not seeing it here. I mean, we've got our theories, but we'll get into that later. Andre, then, what is your real impression of the show overall so far from the pilot?
Well, as we established already, my expectations were low, so it wouldn't have taken much to meet or exceed them. Even as low as my expectations were, they weren't low enough. This still disappointed. The writing was absolutely atrocious. Like, the story itself is fine, but it needed more rewrites to be something workable. The acting is serviceable at best, which is a shame, because some of the actors, they do a really good job, given the limitations of the material. Like, for instance, Anson Mount playing Black Bolt. I kind of feel sorry for him, because he did a great job with what he had to work with, and he was so committed to the role that he created his own sign system, because he didn't want to use the American Sign Language to indicate that this did not originate on Earth. So he did this himself. Why the hell did he do this himself? Someone should have done that for him, and that's my main issue with the series, that it just failed at every level higher up, and the actors are just stuck with shit that was never going to work, because the scripts aren't complete. They needed more work, every single one of them. And the filming and the direction, dear God, the filming and direction. Like, let's just begin with the blaring music, which was hopeless and distracting and total shit. And the lighting. Every single scene is lit like a 90s TV series. It's lit almost exactly like the Conan the Adventurer series, starring at Alf Merlin. And it's lit like the Mortal Kombat Conquest series. And Sinbad the Explorer, whatever the hell it was, like those 90s stuff.
I was
That's
say, yeah,
what
it's
it
funny
looks
you bring
like.
that up, because I'm glad that I didn't spend the money to go see this on IMAX, because that was my exact thoughts. As the beginning of this episode looks like a Xena the Warrior Princess episode from the 1990s.
But they were from the 90s, and that's how everything looked then, so that was fine. But this is 2017, and we should be so beyond that. But beyond the lighting and the color palette, which really didn't work, it's a matter of how the shots are staged and framed and filmed. And that was total bullshit, like so low budget, so garbage. And when you look at who they got filming this, it's no surprise why. Because this was filmed by director Roel René, and he's made a few things back in his native Holland, and he has also made such cinematic masterpieces like The Scorpion King 3, and The Marine 2, and Death Race 2, and Death Race 3, and other direct-to-video bullshit.
Director for hire, in other words.
Yeah, pretty much. And there's nothing wrong with that, provided that you are good. Now let's just contrast this with some other talent that they have in other series. Like, for instance, just look at the Orville. The pilot episode was directed by Favreau, who directed Iron Man and a bunch of other things. Like, these other TV series, they can get like this fairly A-list talent. And for Inhumans, Marvel got this guy, who does direct-to-DVD bullshit, and it shows. Like, for instance, the thing that I thought was the worst was this fight scene between Medusa after her hair had been shaved off and the other woman. I don't know the name of the one, the dark-haired one. Anyway, when they were like fighting on top of the car, it's one of the worst fight scenes I have ever seen. And this is coming from same branch of the studio that gave us the Daredevil hallway fight sequences, which are some of the best fights ever put to camera. And this just leads me to the question, what the hell happened?
Obviously, the main culprits here would be undoubtedly Jeff Loeb, Scott Buck, and Ike Perlmutter. The Inhumans have a storied past, and they've always tried to differentiate themselves from the X-Men. And now here we are again, where they're trying to turn them back into the X-Men. And going back, clear back to the 90s original X-Men, they tried to go with that kind of aesthetic, and even Anson Mount even said in a quote where they're basically trying to emulate that and ground it so much more in quotations. And I've seen so much from the original comics to go, God, that's a mistake. Because now you actually have this elitist royal family that seclude themselves from the rest of the world, and that's more than enough reason to say, well, of course they're going to dress outlandishly and have these costumes and stuff like that. So you can go to that point, and Marvel's been able to do that up to this point, to integrate their costumes without making them feel out of place like the 90s did. But then now you're stuck at this point where these guys decided they were going to try and have this agenda on the other end, and it's at the expense of this show, basically. And Andre and Rob and I all share kind of a theory on how this all went down, but I think Andre explains it best.
Yeah, basically, our theory, and we don't know this for a fact, but based on the observations at hand, it would appear that this whole thing started with the separation between Fox and Marvel and the Fantastic Four and X-Men movie rights. Because as we all know, Marvel cannot access the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. And we have heard previous reports how this drove Ike Perlmutter crazy, to the point that if he saw a poster of the Fantastic Four on the wall, it would remind him of Fox, and it would send him into a rage where he would go to the poster and tear it apart with his teeth or something. He's quite the character, as we've covered before. And so the speculation goes that he wanted to establish Marvel's own ersatz X-Men. Can't have the real X-Men? Okay, fine, well fuck the X-Men. We're gonna make the Inhumans our X-Men. And so you had this huge push for Inhumans in the comics, and they were set up on TV. And then it was apparently also Perlmutter who mandated that Kevin Feige make an Inhumans movie in Phase 3. And this reportedly is something that Kevin Feige didn't really want to do, because the Inhumans didn't really fit his grand plans for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He did, however, want to do Black Panther and Captain Marvel, both of which were movies that Ike Perlmutter was against, for the reasons that toys based on black people and on women apparently don't sell as much. But some trading happened, and Kevin Feige then apparently agreed to do an Inhumans movie if he was allowed to do his passion projects, Black Panther and Captain Marvel. But then, as we covered already, the Disney restructuring happened, in which Marvel Studios was taken away from underneath Marvel Entertainment and placed directly under the Disney banner, meaning Kevin Feige, and Kevin Feige alone had control over the Marvel movies. He no longer had to go through Ike Perlmutter. Shortly after this happened, about the same time that they had to shift the release schedule anyway because Spider-Man became available, Inhumans was pushed back indefinitely. And some started speculating already then that all the other movies shifted around, got new dates, not Inhumans. What does this mean? And sure enough, eventually Inhumans was taken off the release schedule altogether and shifted over to TV, the domain still controlled by Ike Perlmutter. So I still think it was Ike Perlmutter that demanded that, okay, fine, Kevin Feige won't make the movie, well, I still want my ersatz X-Men, so we're going to do them on TV. And then it befell on Jeff Loeb, who is in charge of Marvel TV, to develop the TV series. And Jeff Loeb, he's a little bit more hit and miss than Kevin Feige. It would appear that the end result of the Marvel TV series depends very much on which showrunner Jeff Loeb appoints to actually create the series in question. With Daredevil, he had great luck. With Jessica Jones, also worked out pretty well. When with Luke Cage and with Iron Fist, a little bit more mixed results. And then, for some weird reason, he chose to appoint Scott Buck, after Scott Buck had already failed with Iron Fist. He still appointed him to oversee Inhumans because in business, whenever there is a project or something that is to be produced and delivered, you have 3 dimensions, 3 qualities. And of the 3, you can only have 2 at any given time. And those 3 qualities are cheap, fast, and good. You can have it good and you can have it fast, but then it won't be cheap. You can have it good and you can have it cheap, but then it won't be fast. Or you can have it fast and you can have it cheap, but then it won't be good. And it would appear that here they opted for cheap and fast, meaning good had to go, which clearly it did. But it didn't have to go quite as badly as it did. And for that we can blame Scott Buck, a man who for some reason is showrunner, even if he obviously has no reason being showrunner. Because not only did he write the scripts that were not in any shape to be filmed, he also appointed the director, who was so dead wrong for this project. And yeah, it's normal for pilots not to be up there with the best episodes that are to come later on, because in a pilot is where you kind of find your feet. But it's very seldom for a pilot to be this freaking bad.
And to be fair, we keep calling it a pilot, but it really wasn't, because this went to series right away. This was all planned out. This was all filmed at the same time. It was set up to be what it was from the start. This wasn't like your standard pilot, like you said, because usually they sometimes they even reshoot an entire pilot to get more of the feel they want. This is a situation where they should have known what they wanted going in, like a film.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that what they should have done here, even if Scott Buck wasn't capable of seeing that, oh my god, this is shit, we can't release this, someone higher up in the system needed to have seen this and determined that this is unreleasable. Yeah, of course we can release it. We can save a short-term buck on it, but no pun intended. But at what cost? Like, this is going to harm the brand identity. Like, the Marvel brand itself, that might not be damaged too much because you have Thor Ragnarok coming out, and by all accounts that's going to absolutely kill it. So it shouldn't do too big damage to the Marvel brand itself. But the Inhumans brand, that's gone. That's dead on film. So basically, I think that they should have decided that this is unreleasable. Fine, we'll have to write down however many millions we're talking about and reshoot the entire thing. There's no shame in it. Yeah, it's bad, it doesn't look good, but honestly, I prefer that they do that. Like, for instance, what they've done with the Justice League. Think of all the money they poured into remaking that. Twice now. First they did the initial cut with Zack Snyder, and then they de facto remade it once with Zack Snyder. Still didn't work. Then Joss Whedon was brought in to remake it yet again, and now it appears they have a functional product based on early word of mouth from advanced screenings. That is what they needed to do here. They needed to throw whatever money was at it and find someone else to actually salvage this. If that meant discarding the whole thing, I honestly think they should have done it.
I agree. And this also goes to show that at least somebody knew somewhere at some point that this wasn't going to work, because Disney had to basically force ABC to not only keep S.H.I.E.L.D. but take this, I guess, in a way, because it was getting to a point where with all the IMAX stuff, they even backed out of their part of their deal, and they claim it was to take it early, which turned out to be a good plan for them, obviously, but at the same time, they obviously didn't have the faith in it, and nobody could argue with it considering the poor box office response it did have in the IMAX showings. So basically, you know, this also goes to show that Marvel isn't exactly critic-proof.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there is anything to learn from this, it is that Marvel is not critic-proof. And when they deliver something that isn't good enough, critics will slaughter it. Not only will they slaughter it, they will seemingly take a certain level of delight in it. So anyone thinking that Marvel buys off the critics, think again. Listen to this roundtable one more time.
Well, and I think they fucked up, like where I said, this could have been the Game of Thrones for the Marvel Universe. It could have been on Netflix. You could have spent half the money on it. It could have been dark and gritty, and I don't mean visually dark, but I mean in a sense that, like I said, it could have been your Game of Thrones. You have a lot of family, you have royalty, you have backstabbing, you have all the incest, all the shit that you need for Game of Thrones, all wrapped up in this lovely little package, and they wasted that opportunity.
Yeah, it's a crying shame.
Yeah. We actually do have the ratings for Marvel Inhumans, and they were not all that great. For the time slot, the 8 to 10 time slot, the Inhumans only pulled in 3.1 million viewers on ABC. This is on a Friday night, mind you. So traditionally, television hasn't been that strong on a Friday. But compared with other programs in its time slot, the CBS series MacGyver, which is a reboot, pulled in 6.6 million. And Hawaii Five-0 over on CBS pulled in 8.5 million. So the Inhumans didn't win its time slot, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Guys, I'm not American. I don't know too much about the American TV schedule. But if a pilot episode like this is put on a Friday, which apparently is not a good TV night, would you say that this has been placed out to be dumped?
Considering that you had the whole situation with, obviously ABC wanted to dump S.H.I.E.L.D. completely, and then Disney forced them to keep it, and then they move it to Friday night, that to me feels like they don't have any faith in it whatsoever. Either or, both.
Yeah, what happens is if they don't have a lot of confidence in a show, or if there's really nowhere else to put a show, they will put it on Friday night. The death knell for anything is Saturday night. There have been programs over the years that had done well on Saturday night.
Beyond family entertainment, you usually have to have a show that has a very strong following to make it on a Friday night. X-Files was a perfect example that started on Friday nights.
I don't think that Friday night is actually going to be a benefit for the Inhumans in any way.
But about the rest of the series, because it hasn't done well in the ratings, to be honest. Like, keep in mind, this is the premiere, and even if Friday isn't the best day, still, these level of ratings. By comparison, Enterprise, back in 2005, averaged 4 million views when it was cancelled. So this debuted with less figures than got Enterprise cancelled on UPN. And this is ABC.
So yeah, not good.
Yeah.
So that then covers what we think happened behind the scenes of the Inhumans and why the pilot fared so poorly. But of course, we have now seen more than just the pilot. Episode 3 is also out. What did you think about Episode 3? Rob?
Better than the pilot. You start to see some of the characters' personalities come through. I like Black Bolt more. I like Ensign Mountain's portrayal of Black Bolt more. But it still suffers from a lot of the same problems. The cheapness of it. There's elements in it you like, but on the whole, you just feel like it could be more. Like Serinda Swan as Medusa, kind of that lost girl wandering around the beach. I kind of like that. She's out of her element, proverbial fish out of water, and she has to go and she has to improvise a disguise and everything. But at the same time, like I said, there's parts of it you like, but on the whole, there's just something about it that feels unfinished, almost incomplete about it.
Tom?
Before we got to this, I kind of talked privately with both of you separately, just trying to wrap my head around what the fuck most of this means and why it is this way. And I've come to the conclusion, just like Rob said, this episode was better than the pilot episodes, and I did notice that this one did have a different writer. I can't recall the writer's name offhand, but I noticed it did have a different writer than Buck. So that does make a difference, and there are a lot of elements and parts of this show that I did enjoy a lot, especially the Black Bolt stuff, like Rob said. But I still had the same problems as I did with the first episode. You're stuck in a position where the only person you can root for is the villain, Maximus, because his goal and his plot and what he's doing is the only thing that makes sense. Because even though the other Inhumans that are stranded on Earth are likable for the most part, because they all are, The problem with it, though, is you can't root for their cause because they're basically the ones enslaving these people underground. And what I gathered from Robb and talking to Andre about it beforehand was you really gotta change the narrative of this story to make it work. And unfortunately, they didn't do that here. And I really understand what Robb is saying, but it does feel like a half-finished production. All the way through the first pilot episodes through now, it feels like it's very rushed. I don't see where the money was spent. And I feel like I'm watching a 90s superhero film still. Even though this third episode was a little bit better, it's a little bit different than a recent show that came out called Star Trek Discovery, which I'm sure many of our listeners now are aware that we talk about as well. So unlike Star Trek Discovery, which is like one of those train wrecks that you just want to cringe and turn away from because there's body parts flying everywhere and everything like that, Inhumans is the kind of train wreck that you can't look away from. Because there's so much about it that's intriguing, and you're like, God, they could have done something really great with this, and unfortunately we got stuck with this now, and it feels just like a huge wasted opportunity. Just like I said before, it's still basically how I feel now and going forward. I just don't know if they could fix this at this point, because it just doesn't make sense. There's so much of it that just, it brings up more questions than it does give me answers. And there's a lot of stuff in the third episode that should have been in the pilot episode to help explain things.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. It's funny you've mentioned the things that should have been in the pilot, but I was here instead. Two things I would like to bring up are the writer and the director, both of which were different in episode 3, which is why it was so much better than the pilot, and it really was better. It's still not good because it builds on the terrible pilot, but it's better. Now it's much more easy to sympathize with what is the villain of the show, basically the brother back on the moon who wants to take over, and you can perfectly well understand why, because the Inhumans, they're ruled in a horrible discriminatory caste system. And Black Bolt and Medusa, they are really, really despicable, horrible leaders. And Maximus, he's in the right. And it's much easier to root for him in this episode because he doesn't talk about going to Earth. That stupid thing he was talking about in the pilot. Like, why would he want to go to Earth? What's his plan? Like, go to Earth and do what? Integrate? Yeah, they can't do that apart from the ones that look too freaky. Or do they plan to take over? Because there's just, 1,400 of them, so that's not going to go very well. So what's his plan with going to Earth? Earth wasn't mentioned with a word here, only like giving the people equal rights, so it's very easy to root for him. At the same time, though, even if Black Bolt and Medusa are horrible characters, Anson Mount does a really, really good job portraying him in a very likable way. So all kudos to Anson Mount for doing that. Still, overall, though, even if it's an improvement, it's too little, too late, and they have to do so much to set things right after that pilot. And the bigger issues with the designs and the cinematography and everything, that's all there. So I think there are some very extreme limitations as to how good this possibly can be going forward. Which brings us to the final topic. How excited are we going forward for the rest of the series, let alone season 2? Rob?
I'm more curious than excited. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes. It's a mess, but it's kind of an interesting mess, if that makes any sense. Because you can pick it apart and you can sort of analyze it and you can say, why does this happen? Why does this happen? This doesn't make sense. It almost makes like a case study of how not to do this kind of series, really.
Yeah, I agree with that. And even to build more on what Andre just said before, basically your structure is only as strong as your foundation. And summing up what he said basically, and that is this, that the pilot is your foundation. And that is so shitty that you have such a shitty foundation to build on top of. There's very little you can do now. So there's so many problems in those first 2 episodes that regardless of how good this episode is, and it was good, that going forward, I just don't have very much hope. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of moments like that there was in the third going forward that I'll enjoy, but like Rob said, it's more like a case study at this point. It's like a slow motion train wreck that you can't turn away from because you got to see how preposterous it gets next. But at the same time, there's still elements of it that keep you intrigued enough to kind of think, well, if they could just turn it around, I could be invested in this. It could have been probably my favorite Marvel show of the bunch, even better than Daredevil.
Would have, could have, should have, but didn't really happen. As for me, I'm not really excited. Like, the foundation, it just isn't there. they've already messed it up and they can try to fix it. Maybe I'll come back. But like, if you tell me right now, I can't see any more Inhumans, I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. As it is right now, the thought of seeing any more is more like a chore than anything. Like, I have zero enthusiasm for it. And the only one I see having any enthusiasm is showrunner Scott Buck, who has gone out and talked about season 2 and how excited he is for that. Yeah, like there's going to be a season 2. I don't see the interest out there, not with the ratings for the pilot, and it's not going to go up anytime soon. So season 2, yeah, that would surprise me. So if there will be any roundtables covering future Inhumans episodes, don't really know. We'll see what we feel like and what you guys want to. We will carry on covering both Star Trek Discovery and the Orville though, but not on the main channel. The roundtables covering those shows will from here on out be on the sister channel, Midnight's Edge After Dark. So go sign up for that if you want your weekly fix of Star Trek and Orville news.
So we'd like to thank you for joining us here at Midnight's Edge for our Inhumans Roundtable. And if you like the Roundtable, you like our discussions here, and you like the mini documentaries and everything we do, then we encourage you to please hit that subscribe button and to click the bell icon. That way you'll be notified whenever new content is uploaded. And if you do like the channel and what we do, then please consider supporting the channel through Patreon. Supporters on Patreon will receive various bonus content. You'll receive special Lost episodes. You'll get bloopers. You'll get outtakes. You will get the full uncut audio for the Alien mini documentary. I can't stress that enough, people. So please enjoy that. You know, I took extra special care to record that for you. And if you can't support the channel through Patreon, then please subscribe and then support us that way. So one more time, we'd like to thank Andre.
Cheers, everyone.
And Mr. Tom Connors.
Thank you for joining us.
And I am your narrator supreme, Robb Robot Shlomo, and we will catch you next time.